Documentaries don't come up all that often when talking about Oscar snubs, but man was this film snubbed last year. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2018 documentary film, Won't You Be My Neighbor? If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. Won't You Be My Neighbor features Fred Rogers, Francois Clemmons, and Joanne Rogers, and was directed by Morgan Neville. Using archival footage, interviews, and animated interludes, it documents portions of Fred Rogers' life, most notably as it pertains to the development, production, and impact of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Before this documentary was released, I really didn't know all that much about Fred Rogers. I can recall watching episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood on PBS every now and then in the early 90s, but I was definitely more of a Reading Rainbow kid. Nevertheless, I did watch him sometimes, but I don't have any specific memories of the show other than Mr. Rogers himself. He always seemed like the ultimate grandpa to me. Colorful sweaters and that overly sweet and nice demeanor. I only ever knew him when he was already an old man, so this documentary provided me with a surprising window into his earlier life. It was interesting to see that he was such an old man, even as a young man. The people interviewed as part of this documentary were an interesting mix that provided different angles of the same perspective. Mr. Rogers was an all-around amazing person. They all had the same story. His wife, his kids, cast members of the show, guests of the show, and even a humorously blunt crew member who helped prevent this film from being too wholesome. The insight and stories that these people provided all combined to help solidify the picture we all already have of Mr. Rogers. I wasn't a big fan of the animated interludes that were intermixed with these interviews, but they weren't terrible. They just seemed like unnecessary filler that took away time from where this film really shined, the archival footage. This archival footage was not only of the show itself, but also of interviews Mr. Rogers gave over the years, as well as more candid behind-the-scenes footage of him practicing songs and pontificating on child thought processes. But the best parts of this footage? Watching Mr. Rogers interact with children. Or maybe more specifically, watching how children interacted with him. They just opened up to him. For many of the kids he talked with, it seemed like he was the first person who had ever treated them as equals, rather than talking down to them. Mr. Rogers didn't just talk with the kids, he actually listened to them. There was one demonstrable scene that struck me in particular. Mr. Rogers was chatting with a small group of children, and one of them was a girl with a disability of some sort that made it difficult for her to speak. She had drawn pictures of the puppets for Mr. Rogers and was really excited to give them to him. He sat there with a genuinely enthralled look on his face as she showed and described the pictures to him. Despite her constantly stumbling over her words and repeatedly pausing for several seconds at a time, he never once interrupted or tried to interject a word that she may have been searching for. He just listened. I remember his show being incredibly wholesome, but I was appreciative to learn that Mr. Rogers made a point to never lie to kids, even in the name of entertainment. I never realized how thematically deep his show was, presenting difficult topics in a way that kids could understand. Even when kids were amazed that he was able to get out of the TV, he would explain how TV worked and what a TV show actually was. He never appeared in the make-believe world of his show, always remaining in the house. And when off-screen, he frequently interacted with kids using his puppets, but making it obvious that he was the one controlling those puppets. It was amazing to me just how lost people got in those puppets. Mr. Rogers was no ventriloquist, so there wasn't any trick to it. It was just his hand and his voice in a sock puppet, but kids would get so absorbed, especially with Daniel the tiger. In this film, there's a scene where a kid was talking with Mr. Rogers about his cat that had been hit by a car, but he wasn't really telling Mr. Rogers about it at all. He was telling Daniel. Even though Mr. Rogers was a foot away, this kid was having the conversation with the puppet, never even looking at Mr. Rogers' face unless Daniel acknowledged his presence. The puppet was just as real as Mr. Rogers because of the empathy that he imbued to it. And it wasn't just kids either. There was a surprising scene where Mr. Rogers was being interviewed by Tom Snyder, and he brings out Daniel, and Tom has a conversation with the puppet, and then seems genuinely startled afterwards when Daniel redirects his attention back to Mr. Rogers. I can see why this film caused so many people to cry. I don't even have much of a connection with Mr. Rogers, and I could definitely feel myself getting a little teary-eyed at times. Many in my theater were outright sobbing at various points during this film. I do wish there had been a little bit more about his personal life beyond the show, but I suppose it would have been redundant. Everybody interviewed said the same thing. Mr. Rogers was exactly the same in real life as he was on the show. It's strange to think that there ever existed such an endearingly nice person. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number one is definitely the archival footage. Whether it was clips from Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, interviews with Fred Rogers himself, or even behind the scenes on-set footage, I loved it. The narrative provided by the documentary is great and all, as are the contemporary interviews that provided some context, but I could have honestly watched another 2 hours of archival footage and been happy with it. There's just something fascinating about watching Fred Rogers interact with kids, and then getting to hear his philosophy regarding early childhood education. Incredibly interesting stuff. My second pro kinda relates to the first one, and is very obvious, but it's Fred Rogers. Documentary style is important, but without an interesting topic or subject, there's almost no way to create a thoroughly engaging documentary film. But this movie really shines thanks to Mr. Rogers. On paper, he might not sound like the most gripping subject, but I was fully invested in this film. And that's coming from someone who doesn't have any significant nostalgic connection to the show or the man himself. The third pro is how heartwarming this film is. This is in large part due to Fred Rogers himself. It's incredible just how wholesome, kind, and altogether positive this man was, and it was wonderful to hear that this on-screen persona wasn't a persona at all. It was just him, through and through. I couldn't stop smiling when I saw this movie in the theater, and I couldn't stop smiling while rewatching it at home. This might be the ultimate feel-good documentary. On the con side, the only issue I had with this film was the inclusion of animated interludes. They were well done and weren't a deal breaker for me or anything, but I thought they were unnecessary. They're intended to illustrate Fred's emotions during certain periods in his life via Daniel the Tiger, but I think the archival footage and interviews already did a great job of that. The animated scenes felt a bit redundant and trite. I'm gonna give Won't You Be My Neighbor 4 out of 5 paws. It's a wonderful exploration of an equally wonderful man, and presents a well-rounded picture without trying to stir up controversy. It's interesting, entertaining, and heartwarming, and provides us with a cynicism-free escape, at least for an hour and a half. I would recommend Won't You Be My Neighbor to literally everybody. I know documentaries aren't everyone's thing, but if you're gonna watch one, this is the one to go with. Fans of Mr. Rogers will definitely get a nostalgic boost from the film, but even neighborhood newcomers will enjoy not only learning the history, but also witnessing the impact. It's a feel-good movie that'll leave you smiling, a bit teary-eyed, and most importantly, with a positive outlook on life and the world, at least for a little while. If you liked Won't You Be My Neighbor, I've gotta recommend A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. It's a Mr. Rogers biopic-esque film and is based on the true friendship between Fred Rogers and journalist Tom Junod, who makes several interview appearances here. If you want another recent, sweet, and heartwarming film, you should check out The Peanut Butter Falcon. It's not a documentary or even based on anything, but it'll leave you with a smile on your face. And if you want another film about positivity and altruism that'll tug at your heartstrings a bit, you might want to watch Pay It Forward. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Won't You Be My Neighbor? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, was Mr. Rogers an important part of your childhood? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.